Hi all, this is a video on the IGBB for the PTR. The PTR IGBB is interesting because it is a class that is heavily nerfed due to shirking fort, but is also at the same time buffed because cartridges were not being calculated in the elemental damage conversion for Blunderbuss. So Blunderbuss, effectively all of its elemental damage is getting a 1.2 times buff, which basically means that you'll be able to do, I'd say, about 10 to 15% more damage than you currently are on live. And with how people are going to be playing with their blunderbuss, it's going to be a little bit different. But I'm going to do this one specifically guided to IGBB, not IG or not BB Firestaff. BB Firestaff would typically use a ruby, versus this build would typically use a opal for when I'm going over. In terms of what you're looking for, in terms of like the big changes, so this is a Fortify graph of like the live versus PTR. It's a little bit better one than I've shown in the past. So basically, what this means, and off my post, you could if you read this, but basically, if you're in light and you have Fortify on Blunderbuss, it's an active debuff. Fortify needs to be avoided at all costs. That includes orbs. It includes any form of Fortify on the Blunderbuss, except for the 50% one, because that one's significant enough where it gets over that threshold where it's no longer a debuff, but it's still not as good. Effectively, in light, your Fortify is worth about a fourth of what it is typically. In medium is close to a half, and heavy it's about three quarters, a little bit under three quarters. So that's basically what this graph means. If you are in light on current patch and are at 50% fortified, you'll be heavier than a heavy blunderbuss with like 125 or something crazy percent fortify on the PTR. So there's basically no way to actually like catch up to that. And fortify in general is a lot worse. That being said, in heavy fortify, I don't think is bad. I just think elemental version tends to be a little bit better. But if you're playing on point, I could definitely see a reason to have shirking fort because that will apply to all classes, even if it's a little bit worse on paper. So getting into specs and like what you're looking for on a blunderbuss, this is a heavy tree. I started with light trees before, so I want to go to heavy. On heavy, you typically want to maximize your abilities and not really worry about the actual damage that you deal. That's why I'm not taking ramp, not why I'm not taking deep load. I tend to like to go for blast shot because that lets me get to this apparatus. Why apparatus is really interesting is because this perk is later on in the in the skill tree. It will not be affected by freedom. Freedom affects the base perk duration, which is 3 seconds, but it will not affect this increase to 7 seconds. So that's 4 seconds guaranteed of a 50% slow, which makes it a very, very scary build to get to this apparatus. And the best way to get to apparatus is to go blast shot. So even though blast shot is a little bit less value typically than Azoth, I tend to find it to be worth it in heavy because spamming this apparatus is really, really strong on people that are outside of point. And even if you're on point, if you just target certain people with it, you can end up with a lot of kills. In terms of what you want on for the rest of your tree, this is pretty much it. Future Endeavors isn't super useful. Running Gun's like okay. Fortify Aggression's not quite a debuff in heavy. Run a Roll is not bad, but not super great in heavy. Uh, you you will not find much of a better tree than this, I think. There are things that you can consider similar to the light and medium trees, which happen to be the exact same. This is what you're going to be looking at for light and medium. You no longer want to go for honor roll because honor roll is an active debuff in light, and medium and honor roll tends to be more of a debuff. You need to get to about 10% fortify on medium for it to no longer be a debuff. So you're typically going to have this be a debuff due to invigorated punishment. If I did not say that earlier, invigorated punishment, it has been noted by the devs to be a bug though, so it may get fixed. So this may change in the future. But this is off a post I did 7 days ago, and it has not made it to the PTR patch. So I still have to treat it as if that invigorated punishment nerf is not coming to fruition. So this is what you want in terms of your trees. In terms of like what you're looking at on gear, it's pretty similar for all the specs. Starting with heavy on your in terms of like what you want resil, you want elemental aversion or shirking fort. I think this is the one class where shirking fort is not that bad. And then I would go ward. You also have the option to go freedom. I think freedom's going to have a little bit less value next patch. And there's been an argument where if you get stunned on point, it's not as impactful because you'll get hit by two stuns or I think it's you have to be knocked down and get hit by two stuns and then you get a free dodge rules the mechanic. If you are consistent with playing with that for that, you don't need to the freedom typically. I think it depends on the meta a little bit though, because if there are enough vines on the point, then you typically need the freedom. I'm expecting next patch to be less clumpy, and I don't think that you will need the freedom to survive as much. And instead, you can be more greedy and just use your ice gauntlet to break out of those along with cleanse pots without necessarily needing the freedom itself. On your amulet, I think health, fire, stam is a solid amulet overall for next patch. On your ring, party, refreshing ward, invig is what I would tend to go for in heavy. On earring, refreshing toast, regenerating, refreshing ward. So this is teardrop. It's free to farm from blunderbuss and black powder. So I would go get that. On your blunderbuss, you want plague splitting grenades. This is really good util, 24% disease. Chain will help you build your ult a little bit faster. And then on your last perk, I'd say it's preference. I would say Keen Speed is my personal favorite, but Keenly Jagged's a close second. But I know some people that go for Enchanted and try to get a little bit more damage on their tree, and then they'll manipulate their tree a little bit so that it is less tank oriented, and maybe swap some of these to like deep load in the ramp, and then you have okay damage, but you still are in heavy, so you're missing 10 to 20% damage from being in another spec. But that is one interesting part about that. In terms of on Ice Gauntlet, what you want, Deadly Frost. I say Ice Gauntlet because that's what it's typically paired with. I think you can play it with Void Gauntlet, but Ice Gauntlet tends to be a little bit better. Deadly Frost, Refreshing Ward, and the last slot is Preference. On both of these, I would go for a kind of either Malachite or for an Opal dot Rune Glass gem. It does not matter the dot of your choice. Typically with Blunderbuss, if you go past the 250 int threshold, it is inoptimal to run that. So if you are going for a bile, which I do say here, I actually would go back on that and say for your blunderbuss, you want to actually do either a ruby or some sort of elemental dot gem. Probably actually not a ruby because ruby will be warded against. You're not going to be stacking fire damage with, on the heavy. So I would do anything like but a ruby and as a dot gem in your blunderbuss. When you get above that 250 int, that's where you actually start doing more damage with a ruby than the other things, and that combined with uh, the 1.2 extra damage that you're going to get in a ruby on PTR compared to live will actually tip it in that favor. I have stats on that. If you guys want them to share, you can DM me for them. But the person that has helped me like do some of those stats has said not to give that out without his consent, so I am not going to be showing those on here today. But run a ruby if you get above that 250 int is my takeaway from this, and 250 int will also extend the duration of your bile, so I think it's generally worth it in here. So stat split, which I forgot to put in here, 50 strength to 50 int, and then rest con. So con will be a little bit over 200 typically, to 215 to be exact. Yeah, I'm being consistent with my convention there. On your gems, you want a little bit more slash and physical, I'd say, with Blunderbuss because you're going to generally be on point. I would do 15 slash. I would do 10 general physical, 21 fire. So that's your amulet, a ruby, and 5 your Ellie. And those Ellies will just be opals. And then your ult, I think bile is best with this because you'll be farming ult really, really fast if you're on Ice Gauntlet and you go for the pylon burst tree. So I need to change this actually, and this needs to be 4 times and 1 times pylon burst. Sorry for missing that. Pylon Burst is really, really good at building your ult. If you drop that on point and no one breaks it, every single one of those AoEs that radiates from the pylon will proc your dot. The individual hits will proc your dot. Basically, if you run a pylon, and this is the main reason why it's used as a secondary across a lot of builds, you will get your ult almost twice as fast compared to a normal build. I've had games with Blunderbuss where I have averaged ult times of 20 to 30 seconds for 3 minutes straight because I was just not dying and spamming abilities. Also, this 250 int will also make your nades burn damage last longer. I think there is an argument to replace the refreshing ward or the invig on your ring with burning, which sounds really weird, but it will make that stuff last a little bit longer. You'll get an extra few ticks towards your ult charge, and it'll help you farm ult a little bit faster, but that's like a pure util setup. I think there's also an argument to go infected, but infected does not boost the duration of bile, it only boosts the duration of your plague splitting grenades, so it does not seem worth it for BB overall, but if you're running BB VG, I think it's worth it, but BB IG, I don't think it is. Go into medium, I'd say 5 times resil, 5 times LA aversion. I would not go shirking for it with this class. 3 to 4 times refreshing, 1 plague splitting grenade. 0 to 1 unending thaw, and then the other thing I forgot to put on here is 0 to 1 times the exhaustive net shot, and I guess I can go for the heavy as well. It's an optional perk, I would say, but it's a very, very good perk if you can get it. It basically will make it so that people can't gender stam very, very fast. It is one of the I'd say it's better than unending thaw generally, but it is a little bit harder to find those pieces, and they tend to be ones that you have to roll for. I don't find that it impacts me a lot as a heavy player on point, but I know off point it can shut people down significantly. So it's something I would consider in medium and something I would definitely consider in light. And if you're gonna get that, then I would just basically cut a refreshing, and then I would go to 2 to 4 times refreshing in armor on both these classes. Spoiler alert: light is basically the same thing as medium, just with different ring. Your amulet, same thing, health slash stam, or sorry, health fire stam. Used to saying health slash stam. Fire damage, invig, leeching is what I would go. Your leeching perk is optional, but I don't really know of a better thing to get than the leeching, so I would just tend to go for that. Under earring, refreshing toast, regenerating, I'd say purifying toast is what you want next patch because it will get rid of those smoldering chats, or at least has a chance to get rid of the smoldering stacks, and those will really add up and do big damage over time to you. On your BB itself, this is kind of a must-have for medium and light. It's also super expensive to roll, unfortunately, so I think it's generally best to get a two perker, and then get like a okay third perk. But if you're going for a budget, but on a BIS scale, you want attunement, keenly empowered, and then the next one's enchanted. Enchanted is the last one across basically every single player, except for ones that are like borderline cheating and not missing any shots, and then enchanted tends to be a little bit better. But overall, if you actually look at damage dealt, people that run keenly uh, empowered and attunement tend to do more damage than one people that run enchanted. On your ice gauntlet, same thing. Deadly frost, refreshing movement, and preference. The preferences are the same as this. You want ruinous, you want attunement, or exhaustive exploitation. I think exhaustive exploitation is a little bit on the edge. The reason why it's a little bit better in heavy than it is in medium is it can proc on your pylon. So basically, if your pylon hits someone that is stammed, they will gain a little bit of a slow effect. So it's like interesting, but it's not super strong. It's like a 15% slow, but it's something, right? And that will proc on your pylon abilities, unlike most of the perks on the pylon, so that's why it's kind of interesting there. I don't think it will proc on the dot after the storm, but it will proc on the storm itself, so it's kind of interesting for an exhaust setup. Under gems, this is the same as light. I think you want to do rune rune glass damage on your BB itself. This is for your stats. I forgot to do stats in here. You want to do 200 strength, 150 and then I'd say 100 to 150 con, and then if you're gonna get extra stats, you want to push it into strength, not the end, and that will maximize your BB damage. I have seen people go lower than this on the con scale, but when that was a thing, it was typically when they were going mortar, and I don't think mortar is viable next patch because it was significantly boosted by mortal empowerment. And with that being nerfed, I don't think the mortar tree is super good. That being said, if you are looking for a mortar tree, you can cut out some of these more useless perks on this right tree, and then you can go something akin to I'd say like this, and then I'd probably not go for a net shot if I were going mortar personally, and I would stick to Azoth, which is a lot harder to live in, but you do see people with mortar that are able to live with the setup. And then something like run and gun isn't bad. This last slot's kind of preference, but you don't want the fortify for light, so it's between run and medium in my opinion. So between future endeavors and run and gun, medium I'd say mortar is a lot worse than light. It's best as like a complete glass cannon setup. I imagine it's better with fire staff than it is with blunderbuss next patch. All right. In terms of everything else, this is your gem setup that you're looking for. It can fluctuate a little bit depending on the meta. I'd say just starting out with Fireward is a solid start. There is an argument that you maybe don't have to run as much Fireward because you have all of the elemental version of this setup, in which case, say you wanted to drop the ruby, then I'd probably add to the physical, maybe to slash, but this is like a safe bet to start off, I'd say, for the next meta, and then you can kind of switch accordingly. In terms of your ult and what you want, I'd say you have flexibility here between bile, detonator, and vines. I think detonator and vines are the most popular ones. Vines can set up for your blunderbuss combos pretty well, but being stammed on blunderbuss is like mostly a death sentence. So generally not worth it in my opinion, and I think detonate works really well because you get to take advantage of that 150 int perk, and it does 15% more damage, and it also works off your empower, which you don't tend to have empower. If you want to get empower with this setup, you can look to instead of going a health fire stam, you can run champion. So this would be shirking empower. I don't think that amulet is bad, but then when you do that, then this goes down to 11 fire, and then at that point you're like, do I have enough fire for the next meta? And I'm not sure. I think it's a not a bad setup, but it's sort of a preference thing. So I'd say this is that, or fire is generally what you want for your amulet. On light, it's basically the same thing. Uh, your stats are going to be the same. I'd say nah, with light, generally people just go like full glass cannon, to be honest. Like 150 int is what you want, but I've seen people go like 5 con even with this, and then they'll just keep bumping up their strength. So that would be an upper echelon of like 350 strength, which sounds really really stupid, to be honest. But I probably at that point, to be honest, if I want to go for 350, I'd just go like 200 int and just kind of call it a day at that point. So that way you get a little bit of value out of that perk and you won't lose that much damage, but you will maximize your damage by pumping into strength after you get to that 150 int threshold. And that's for specifically for a mortar setup. But otherwise I would generally not go for that, and I would stick to 100 to 150 con with light. I would not go to 200 con with both these setups because you lose significant amount of damage when you get to that, because you really want to get to that 200 strength perk bonus, which will apply a lot of extra damage. In light, I don't think the shirking and power will proc as consistently as it does in medium, so I wouldn't tend to go for it. And health, fire, stam would be what I would tend to go for. So that would be kind of the same gem setup I talked about at the end there. Uh, you want to get hardy, but fire damage and invig is so important. It's like light is a very very expensive set to set up. Basically, is what I'd warn you for. But if you get it, it's like very very strong. The BB, you kind of need to get this, and these BBs tend to go for like 750k to like 1.25 mil. They're kind of ridiculous, but if the thing is you have to think about is if you get one of those BBs, you're increasing your damage not just by like the enchanted perk amount, but by a decent amount more than that, because the other empowers will proc after your enchanted bonus, I believe. So that's where it gets really, really interesting, and you will start getting a lot more damage out that way. You're basically getting 10% extra damage from your enchanted, or a little bit more than that, so it's definitely worth it. And you're going to do even more damage next patch with the 1.2 change to your cartridges, but you're not going to have the uh, you're going to have to run invig. You're not going to be able to run mortal empowerment, so on the ring, so that's not going to be as beneficial for light setup. IG kind of same old, same old. Gems, already talked about that. And light, I think bile is more of a consideration. I wouldn't tend to go vines because you tend to play kind of further away. So I'd say it's like bile, detonate, or even cannon. I wouldn't go the firestorm because that is best for animation canceling out of abilities, and there aren't really long animations on the blunderbuss that you need to animation cancel. I don't think it actually increases your damage that much and doesn't provide a ton of army util, so I would tend to stick to the older ultimates that are a little bit better from ranged. But that's what I would basically go for. The exhaustive net shot is something I forgot to put in here at the beginning, but I would tend to go for that. And the freedom I don't think is as important next patch, especially in with BBs, because you tend to play a little bit off a point. And if someone gets you below 50%, you just proc your 50% fortify, which tends to be enough even in next meta, I imagine, to get out of sticky situations. So I would not worry about that much. And yeah, that's what I have for an updated BB guide, specifically BBIG. But let me know what you guys think. The other thing to take away, for both of these setups, I forgot to put it in here, but you want a dot opal, and in your medium, in your light setups, I'd say opal specifically because that will maximize damage over malachite. And heavy, you play on point, so the malachite tends to proc very often. Off point, it's a little bit more inconsistent. And I would really recommend going for the dot opal. It's a little bit hard to play around having your stem down, but if you could play around it, it will increase your damage output. And that dot opal is a little bit better damage than opal. It is a little bit better than tier 2 fire. It is a little bit better than ruby, unless you get above that 250 int threshold I talked about. And I don't think it's generally worth doing that unless you're in heavy. And the reason why I think it's worth it in heavy is because with bile will increase the damage, but you will reduce the damage of your BB. But in heavy, you don't really care about your damage. I've seen some people cut this 50 strength, go 5 strength, and go 50 focus, and then just maximize on refreshing and get a lot of value out of blunderbuss. So, like, it does not really matter what damage you're doing, you're just looking to live with this class. But the other classes you're looking to maximize on damage, these are nuker builds, so it's completely different setup, and this is what I would recommend going for. And I'll put these notes in the description so you guys can look at them later, but let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you guys in the next video.